afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ASALH Carter G. Woodson National Sites presentation on celebrating the birthday, the 46th birthday of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Our theme is a bold vision, revisiting the life and legacy of Dr. Carter G. Woodson and what it means today. My name is Ida Jones. I'm the newly elected incoming National Vice President for membership of ASALH. My other hat is at Morgan State University as University Archivist. This afternoon session will look at the confluence of the life of Dr. Carter G. Woodson and Mary McLeod Bethune as landmarks of legacy and in stature. As my training as a journalist and from the panel this morning talking about the printed life of Dr. Woodson, I have to provide the 5 W's and 1 H we've learned in journalism school. So who was Mary Jane McLeod Bethune? She was an age mate of Dr. Woodson, born on July 10th, 1875 in Maysville, South Carolina. She was the granddaughter of an enslaved woman she met, the daughter of enslaved parentage she knew, and siblings. She was a daughter and sister to siblings who were also enslaved. She was the 15th of her parents' 17 children. And akin to Woodson in terms of being that generation that's going to transcend the enslavement process, she was allowed to go to school. But prior to her going to school, it was said that she was born with a birth caul, for a thin veil over her face, and when the midwife removed it, her eyes were open. And so according to the wives' tale, that she would see and do great things because of that unusual birthing experience. As a young child, she would accompany her father to the weighing stations for the cotton. And because of her education, she was able to ferret out the injustices economically when farmers were being given the inappropriate amount of money for their harvest. So she would actually survey and make sure that the farmers were being adequately compensated. So in her early life, pre-high school level education, she was very vigilant and committed to understanding equity. Throughout the course of her life, what she desired to do as a young person was to become a missionary. That was her initial career goal. As a member of the Presbyterian faith that was very popular in the post-Civil War America in the South, she wanted to be a Presbyterian missionary to Africa. She attended the Dwight Moody Bible College in Chicago and actually met Dwight Moody himself. And it was told by the church that she would not be selected to be a missionary because she was unmarried and ultimately because she was African American. Slightly dejected and disappointed, she returned to South Carolina and involved herself in various sundry types of work. She then meets a woman named Lucy Craft Laney, a woman who was also a person of faith, who was born in enslavement and who dedicated her life to teaching. Lucy Laney says, our people need education in Christ as much in America as they do in Africa. It was shortly after that encounter that Mrs. Bethune records in one of the biographies written about her, having a dream of seeing this bridge where children are just crossing, droves and droves of children are crossing this bridge. And in this dream, she says that she believed that education would be the missions field that the Lord would assign her hand to. And Lucy Craft Laney confirmed that assumption or that vision. It is then when she migrated to Palatka, Florida, and saw a space that she just viewed in her mind's eye of what it could be. And that was the origins of what is now Bethune-Cookman University. So similar to Woodson, this thrust and this quest for education is who Mrs. Bethune was from her early life to her adult life, and also the sense of Christian stewardship as Woodson as well. What she sought to do was to provide an education principally for girls, but eventually she became coeducational and eventually ecumenical. One of the earliest of her students was a man by the name, I believe, Howard Thurman. And so as a result, she interacts with these men and does great work for them as well as their formative years in Florida. In education, she then becomes a club woman, and she joins the National Association of Colored Clubs, and she rises to the presidency of that particular organization. The NACWC had in its constitutional limits 2 terms, so she could not run for a subsequent term. And that's when she chose to leave in the late 1920s. Upon her departure, her administration had actually been able to give the NACWC a national headquarters at 16th and R Street Northwest, which they still currently own. Her club activity and her presence was rising in the women's movement. She was also a suffragist, lending her voice to that very strategically, being based in a very red state of Florida, very strategically lending her voice to African-American women in the South on how to engage the suffrage movement and remain alive and not threatened. When she meets Carter G. Woodson in 1923, she's going to be the first African-American woman who's going to be elected to the council in 1935, excuse me. She's elected to the National Association of Woodson's organization in 1935. Trying to read my scribbled notes, pardon me, getting very excited. In 1923, she also delivers an academic paper at the association meeting, the same time Lucy Harth Smith, another educator out of Kentucky, is going to be publishing in the Journal of Negro History. So Bethune is at the very origins of the association as it's proliferating among African-American educators across the strata, the K-12 and the collegiate. In 1935, as I said, she was elected to the Executive Council. She was the first African-American woman elected to the council. And in 1936, within 1 year, she was then elected to the national presidency of the ASNLH at the time. In that same window, she's also going to form the National Council of Negro Women. She's also going to be the president of her school, the Bethune-Cookman College. So she's running at least 3 to 4 organizations at one time in that window between 1935 and 1945. You heard earlier this morning that in 1937, it was her vision to create the Negro History Bulletin, to proliferate not just the educators, but also the essays, the writings, and poems of young people, and to make this an inclusive, across generation, across region publication for all African Americans. So she, like Woodson, had this understanding of the diaspora and also the understanding of the intergenerational connection needed between those young people, contemporaries, and the elderly. She is the longest serving president of the association, serving from 1936 to 1950. She is actually going to be there to eulogize Dr. Woodson, and we can talk about that as well. Just in brief, as we move on to our panel, I think it's very important to understand the intersectionality between both Woodson and Bethune. They both understood their stewardship, their Christian mission, to be given a task at hand, and the Holy Spirit to guide them in that task. The idea of being located and domiciled in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital of the quote free world, was extremely important, not only because of Howard University being here, the federal government being here, but all heads of state from around the world would come to Washington, D.C. And it was very important for African Americans to show themselves as their best selves. So Woodson purchasing the home on 9th Street in 1922, Mrs. Bethune purchasing the NACWC house in 1928. Then in 1943, she purchased the council house at 1318 Vermont Avenue. She chose that location, the Logan Circle neighborhood, where people such as Alma Thomas, a notable artist, and Charles Manuel Grace, a sweet daddy Grace, purchased homes as well. So the idea of owning property and being able to establish oneself as an organization and an individual was very important. Finally, as we move forward, it's going to be Dr. Dorothy Height, who will in the late 1960s be able to enter that conversation with the National Park Service to have that home added to the overall rubric of the National Park Service. There had been a fire and the organization had to vacate the building. But having been so inspired by Bethune, Dorothy Height dedicated the best of her life to ensure that there would be a presence of that particular home as well. Finally, another point of confluence between Dr. Woodson and Mrs. Bethune was the importance of story. We heard our national president, our outgoing national president, Dr. Higginbotham, speak about an heirloom. Very important because she understood, like Dr. Woodson did, the stories of her grandmother and her mother, and ultimately her own, would cease to be verbal in a sense that we'd pass away. But the tangible material, the objects, the artifacts, the photographs, the printed publications would all stand as testament and verse to a people who have been here, who've survived, and who have thrived in the midst of very adverse circumstances. In 1946, she's going to inaugurate with the NCNW a National Archives Day. She's going to call to help Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Dr. Dorothy Porter Wesley, and a cavalcade of other women and men to help her formulate this idea of bringing together at 1318 Vermont Avenue all of the elements that tell our history, from the crafts, from the arts, from the family material, so that there would be in this place where the world can meet the Negro woman on her own ground as woman and citizen. So she was very understandable of the idea of archives and history, the intersection of education and stewardship, the need to be intergenerational and also diasporic. So we understand that they really had a sense of synergy of mind. And I believe because they both were children of the South, children of enslaved parentage, and people who were clearly filled with religious zeal to realize that they were not going to create a great name for themselves. They were going to create the strongest link between their yesterday and the tomorrow they would live to see. She lives to see Brown burst the Board of Education and dies shortly thereafter in 1955. And she's very clear in her legacy and will and testament that she leaves in Ebony magazine that each generation should carry on higher, further, and stronger, remembering the yesterday, but also projecting and performing the future. So on that note, I will then finish with this and ask our panelists to come and share greater conversation with us. Dr. Jarvis Givens is an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a faculty affiliate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. His first book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, was published in 2021 by Harvard University Press, and he's currently building the Black Teacher Archive, an online portal which will house digitized records documenting the more than 100-year history of the, quote, Colored Teachers Associations. Professor Givens earned his PhD in African American Studies and from the University of California. And he's a native of Compton, California, and currently resides in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Dr. Givens, the stage is yours, and you can share your screen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I'm excited to be here with you all today for this wonderful occasion. And happy that I have an opportunity to share a bit about my research on Carter G. Woodson and his partnership with African American educators up and through the kind of first half of the 20th century. So I encountered a problem some years ago that would forever alter the trajectory of my research on education and Black life. As a graduate student at UC Berkeley, I had come across a footnoted reference to Carter G. Woodson's school textbooks, one of which you see pictured on the screen here being read by a group of junior high students in the 1930s. This is a photograph that's taken as the students prepare for Woodson to actually visit schools in New Orleans on his way to the annual ASALH meeting that was taking place in Houston that year. I was aware that Woodson had played a central role in African American studies, but I was shocked to learn about the size of his impact on educational practice during Jim Crow in the private spaces of Black teachers' classrooms. Despite his fame as a historian, Woodson's career as an educator, particularly a public school teacher, has often gone overlooked. And yet he was fully immersed in the world of Black teachers until his death in 1950, just before the landmark ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education. And it's during those years, of course, that he published 7 textbooks that circulated widely among Black teachers. He developed magazines and alternative lesson plans and classroom decorations for Black teachers and students. And by 1931, over 80% of Black high schools were actively celebrating Negro History Week. All of these things placed Woodson squarely at the crossroads of education and Black life. And African American teachers themselves referred to Woodson as a schoolmaster to his race. So given this context, I wanted to kind of bring this to the fore, not only in terms of how we understood Woodson, but also to use it as a lens to think about larger themes in the history of Black education. So in my new book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, I trace Woodson's contributions to educational theory and practice. But while Woodson is the principal character of my book, I'm mostly interested in the educational life world around him, the people that taught him, the groups his ideas traveled through, and the teachers who used his curricular materials, as well as the students who reflected on Woodson's impact in their schools. Tracing Woodson through these dynamic threads in the history of African American education reveals with an unrelenting clarity that at its highest calling, the objective of Black education was and continues to be inherently subversive. Understanding Woodson and the network of Black educators to which he belongs offers theoretical and practical resources for educators today, not only for those who teach Black and Brown students, but also for those of us who feel that in the current political climate, that our teaching has become a fugitive project. To emphasize the relationship between Woodson's educational legacy and what I call fugitive pedagogy, I'd like to share the opening scenario from my book. Tessie McGee read to her class in a steady, measured tone, quietly engaging in a calculated act of subversion. She was Black, 28 years old, and she taught history in 1933 at the only Black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The state's all-white Department of Education and the local school board gave clear instructions. Teachers were to keep the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, which they were to follow closely to acquaint their students with the targeted learning objectives. Black educators and families in Webster Parish had little formal control over curriculum, yet on many occasions, Ms. McGee made what she deemed to be necessary revisions to the mandatory curriculum. Based on her own judgment, and perhaps at the recommendation of fellow Black teachers, she often read passages from Carter G. Woodson's book on the Negro, as one of her students recalled, which she kept rested comfortably in her lap. She kept the textbook out of sight, understanding that if she were to be caught, she would surely be vulnerable to the disciplinary practices of Jim Crow authorities, but she was undeterred. Her student recalled, quote, "She read to us from that book, and when the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk, and she began teaching us from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap," end quote. Tessie McGee's method of instruction constitutes a textbook example of what I'm calling fugitive pedagogy. Her concealed lesson rejected the degrading representations of Black life in official school curricula, and such refusal manifested in physical form. What I call fugitive pedagogy consists of African Americans' physical and intellectual acts that explicitly challenged anti-Black protocols of educational domination. And these were actions that often took place in discreet or partially concealed fashion. Teachers like Ms. McGee gained access to these alternative scripts of knowledge through what the sociologist Alden Morris has called insurgent intellectual networks. These were, of course, institutions such as Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which he founded as a school teacher in 1915, but also colored teacher associations. Such institutions comprised a veiled yet networked Black educational world, one where Black teachers often said one thing but did another. Because given rampant anti-Black violence, the true political intentions undergirding Black educational strivings were rarely on full display. And fugitive pedagogy was a collective endeavor, even when it manifested as these individual acts of practice, like in the case of Tessie McGee. For instance, the principal entering Ms. McGee's classroom was a Black man named J.L. Jones. And we know that he was a leading member in the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, which had explicitly endorsed Carter G. Woodson and his work by the 1930s. And we know that Woodson regularly appeared on programs at the annual meetings of Black teacher associations at both the state and national level. To the left, you see Carter G. Woodson's life membership card in the National Organization of Black Teachers, the American Teachers Association, which was formerly called the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools. And to the right, we see one newspaper clipping, one of many, where Woodson was the keynote speaker at many of the Black teacher meetings at both the state and national level. So in light of this history, it's not implausible then to consider that Principal Jones and Ms. McGee may have very likely conspired together. The principal testing the teacher to ensure that she could protect herself and the school if a white official entered the classroom. Because wearing the mask, as the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar called it, had long been part and parcel of Black teachers' professional disposition. In Black segregated schools, the intrusion of white surveillance had a hand in shaping school ecology. It was not atypical for white people to drop by unannounced during the school day, either to show off their Negro school, as some of them put it, to visitors, or for some routine inspection. Such visits were primarily meant to demonstrate power, which was essential to reproducing anti-Black domination. This is to say, the person walking into Ms. McGee's classroom could just as easily have been a white school official. Black educators walked a tightrope when challenging such oppressive schooling contexts, because if they were to fall or be caught, there was no safety net to catch them. For instance, just a few years prior, the white school board in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which was heavily influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, learned that Carter G. Woodson's textbook was being used in the local Black high school. The books were confiscated, the teachers were reprimanded, and the principal was threatened with his life and forced to resign. And after reading the textbook, the school board, quote, expressed horror and surprise that such a work should have crept into our Negro schools, they put it. They went on to assure their white constituents that they would be more vigilant moving forward, stating, quote, we must not take in teachers who will create discord by teaching isms of any sort, end quote. And so it's in this context that Woodson worked fervently from his office at 1538 9th Street Northwest in the historic Shaw District in Washington, D.C. We know that Woodson lived, worked, and died in this building. And it's from this post that Woodson responded personally to letters written to him by individual teachers, some writing him with historical questions, others inquiring in hushed tones about how they might strategically work to challenge curriculum standards on a local level. Woodson and his small staff mailed textbooks to individual teachers in schools across the country. They packaged Negro history kits by hand, and they shipped off decorative materials for teachers to refashion their classrooms. And it was during the Depression years that Woodson's educational program expanded most dramatically. Because after developing an unfavorable reputation among white philanthropists by the 1930s, Woodson would come to rely on the Black masses to support his association for the study of Negro life and history. And as I demonstrate time and again in my book, Black teachers were at the forefront of this cause. So I'm going to stop there, but I want to thank you all for tuning in and for inviting me to share a bit about my work on Woodson and African-American school teachers. And I'm going to pass it back over to Dr. Jones to facilitate the rest of our panel for today.
Thank you, Dr. Gibbons. That is great. Please, if you have questions, you can use the chat or the Q&A function. I also just wanted to correct some of my misstatements earlier. It's in 1923 that a woman named Elizabeth Ross Haynes publishes in the Journal of Negro History. She happens to be the wife of George E.C. Haynes, who is involved in the Brown versus the Board of Education. So there was a question earlier about lawyers and education. So we see in 1923, the wife of George E.C. Haynes is involved with the journal. And secondly, in 1935, this is when Lucy Harth Smith and Mrs. Bethune were both elected to the EC, or Executive Council. And Ms. Smith is actually an educator in Kentucky and was the state president of the College Teachers Associations, of which Dr. Gibbons was mentioning. So we now would like to have to our presenter, Vince Vaise, who is the Chief Visitor Services at National Capital Parks East. Vince leads a team of park staff in interpreting and promoting a number of historic sites, such as the Frederick Douglass House, Mary McLeod Bethune Council House, National Historic Site, and the Carter G. Woodson Home, National Historic Site. This summer, 2022, they're planning a number of initiatives to cross-promote the Bethune and Woodson sites. One of them will be a new walking tour. They're within proximity of each other. Welcome back, Vince. It's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Sorry for the added drama this afternoon. A little, nothing like technology to do that. But all of us, as we were developing the exhibits, with the Woodson Committee and us in the Park Service, I think on my screensaver, we can see Dr. Woodson. And I think all of us had Dr. Woodson looking over our shoulder as we thought of ideas for the Woodson home. And then a lot of us, of course, also had Dr. Woodson in our hearts as we planned the exhibits too. What I wanted to talk about, though, is while we will have that grand opening in 2023, things continue, and we're looking to do a really exciting walking tour this summer. And one thing the team and I were talking about when COVID started is, what can we do outside? And it dawned on us in a lot of the planning meetings that we had with ASALH, we heard repeatedly that one must talk about the context of the Shaw neighborhood and how important that really was. And it just made perfect sense to do a walking tour to bring those together. So I have a presentation here that hopefully you'll be able to see. And you can see here we have Dr. Woodson and Mrs. Bethune, and we'll call it In the Footsteps of History. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can. You're good.
Great, great. So here we have the Woodson home and the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House National Historic Site. As you know, you did a lovely job explaining the centrality of Washington, D.C. and the importance of these places being in Washington, D.C. If you look on the left there, you see 1538, that's the brick building. The rest of the historic site is that kind of off yellow color there. That'll be the museum entrance. And then of course, on the right behind the flower bed is the Bethune Council House National Historic Site. And they're both located very close to one another. If you walk it, it is exactly 15 minutes. And in a way, just like these sites, like these figures are prominent in American history, that really we put a little pin literally on a virtual tour for the Bethune Council House, but these pins are also sites significant to African-American history and American history as well. So when we look at these touchstones to the past, it's more than even the Bethune and the Carter G. Woodson homes. It's many other places that are brought into that broader context. And if I recall, you alluded to other figures, and Mary Jane Patterson residence is in the upper left there near Church Street. She was the first African-American woman to receive a college degree, be a college graduate, BA from Oberlin College. Nearby is St. Luke's Black Episcopal Church, which was DC's first African-American Episcopal church. I think you mentioned Alma Thomas, the artist, lived not far from there. So again, these individuals did not exist in isolation. They exist as part of a community. There were connections to each other. And really, if we want to understand these people and really embody that legacy, we need to bring in that community. But let's start with a little bit of the numbers. We did open the Woodson home in 2017, not fully. The actual Woodson home was opened. However, the rooms were largely unfurnished, although we did put a few touchstones in there to give people a sense, a replica desk of Dr. Woodson's, a little bit of a few props in the packing and shipping room. And even in spite of that, we received well over almost 2,000 visitors in that very first year. The Bethune site, many visitors made the walk. They either went to see the Bethune Council House and then walked to Woodson, or went from Woodson to Bethune. So if you notice the collation there, 2,075 at Bethune. So that's almost a one-on-one. 2018, we had to install a state-of-the-art heating air conditioning system at the Bethune site. So that site was closed. 2019, and I thought this was a very revealing statistic, is how much higher the visitation went. Usually with a lot of museums, you know, the first year it opens, you get that bump and then it starts to die down. Whereas with Woodson, we saw a steady increase. And again, we were still doing the permanent exhibit planning. We had a few temporary props in there, but they weren't permanent exhibits. 2,300 at Woodson, over 3,000 at Bethune. But 2020 was also very revealing for two things. One, we all know that COVID happened, and we had to close those places due to the pandemic in early March. But in spite of that, we were well on track with over doubling the numbers at both sites. So what this is telling us is that we really believe that when we open the Woodson site fully in 2023, with all those permanent exhibits, these numbers are going to go way up. And we want to have that drive people to the Bethune Council House National Historic Site as well. Again, if we take in the context, the neighborhood, the Shaw neighborhood then and now, one thing that these museums and the community, it's not the community, the Shaw and Logan Circle neighborhoods, while they have historic features, they are not static museums. It's a living community. And Woodson and Bethune existed in these living communities. And so we want our sites to be living sites as well. So you have those, again, touchstones to the past, like Howard University, the Howard Theater, where people like Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, but also, you know, more modern times, Shaka Khan performed. And these are places that would have been familiar with these individuals. Visitors that come should get a sense of the local culture that these historic sites existed in, both past and present. So with that in mind, let us walk in the footsteps of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and here are some of the shoes that Dr. Woodson wore that will be on display. When you leave the Woodson site, you look across the street, first thing you see is the former International Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters office. I mean, A. Philip Randolph was there all the time, walked up and down those steps. The big March on Washington, 1963, many of the meetings were held in that very building right there. And literally you can see it from the steps, the porch of the Woodson site. It's literally right across the street. Of course, A. Philip Randolph, a great leader in the civil rights movement, which also touches on another national park unit that my comrade John Fowler made mention of, about Pullman National Historic Site. And then when you walk right up the street, there is the Carter G. Woodson Memorial Park. So, and this memorial park is a Washington, D.C. park. It was put up by the district in 2016. But again, recognizing that Woodson's story is outside of the house too. It's part of the house, but it's also outside of the house. He was not only a resident of the community, he was a pillar of the community. He was recognized. Dr. Givens gave a great talk about the change that Woodson did. Well, those books, Woodson often carried those books himself to mail and ship. He walked himself to the different schools where he gave talks. So he was seen in the community. He was a feature of the community, and he got that enduring nickname, the Bookman, for that very reason, carrying the books. And across the street from that is the YWCA, the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, which is the first and only independent Black YWCA in the nation. Dorothy Height served as executive secretary there from 1939 and 1944. So we wanted to have an image of how she would have looked at that time. Dr. Woodson and Mrs. Bethune had lunch at this very building all of the time. So again, just as the history intersects, they literally intersected and connected at places like this. And these monuments, these are living monuments that are still there today. As you walk down, even simple things such as the old fire department pull boxes. Thank goodness DC saved them as part of an art project. But this unique one here on Rhode Island answered to Engine Company 4, which was the first and oldest African-American fire company in Washington, DC. However, even though it was segregated, there was upward mobility within the fire company. So there were African-American lieutenants, captains of this fire department. Firefighters always like to talk. So you know Dr. Woodson would have talked to these firefighters whose station was literally 2 blocks up from the Woodson home as he walked through the neighborhood. And again, the context, the ride of 1919, you can see where the homes were. And then where you see those numbers are flashpoints where these riots occurred. And don't forget, Dr. Woodson was living in DC at the time, although not at 1538, was living in DC and near the number 1 that you see there. And the riot came through and he had to duck into an alley. And I think it's a testimony to his bravery that he still decided to locate his ASALH, locate his residence only a few years later, right there at 1538. Logan Circle, again, touchstone to the American Civil War, former Camp Barker. And then as you circle around Logan Circle are the Lawson residence at number 8 Logan Circle. You see the little arrow, that brick building there by the old time gas lights. The Lawsons, very powerful, formidable legal couple. Belford Lawson led the case in 1938 that proved the right to boycott in the famous case, the New Negro Alliance versus Sanitary Grocery. And Marjorie Lawson, of course, DC judge, and then was also the US representative to the United Nations for Economic and Social Council. So, and she was also the civil rights director during the Kennedy campaign. And they lived right there. You, Dr. Jones, you mentioned Marcelino Manuel Gracia, or, you know, sweet sweet Daddy Grace, the Bishop Grace, lived it right there, 11 Logan Circle, in that brick building, the little circular building, brick with the turret on it, the United House of Prayer for All People. And then Adam Clayton Powell, the U.S. representative from New York, African-American U.S. representative, he rented the third floor from the Lawsons as well. And we have photographs of Representative Powell at the Bethune Council House. So these folks were not only united in the cause, they were neighbors. This was the neighborhood that they intersected in. And I'll conclude with this photograph here. It's a superimposed black and white photograph from 1944, October 1944, of Mrs. Bethune dedicating the council house there. But we also took a modern photograph about a few months ago, and we blended the two. And one thing to just leave you with is, you know, while we all love reading the great academic books, and that gives us the knowledge and the inspiration, but literally when we walk in these historic neighborhoods between these sites, that these sites don't exist in isolation, that they do exist as part of larger communities. And we are walking in the footsteps of the history. Like where we walk, Dr. Woodson walked. Where we walk, the Lawsons walked. Where we walk, Mrs. Bethune walked. And we're here today. And so as we continue that legacy, let us remember that we're also literally walking in their footsteps. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for that, Vince. It was very enlightening and very refreshing to see all of those lovely DC sites. Our next presenter is Daniel Weldon, Acting Chief of Resource Management for National Capital Parks East from the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Site and the National Registry. This is a recording that will be played, so I will cue the AV folks to run the recording of Mr. Weldon. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Daniel Weldon, the Acting Resource Management Division Supervisor and normally the Cultural Resources Program Manager for National Capital Parks East, which includes the Carter G. Woodson Home National Historic Site. While we are gathered today to celebrate the legacy of Dr. Woodson, I am pleased to briefly update you on an ongoing resource management project germane to our meeting, the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Landmark Nomination Update. This documentation and designation process was made possible through the joint partnership of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, and the National Park Service. Members of both entities participated in a series of draft reviews and workshops discussing the narrative and refining the case for designation. I would be remiss in not acknowledging the hard work of our colleagues, Dr. McWhorter and Dr. Wiley, throughout the entire process. I will provide some general background on National Historic Landmarks before getting into project specifics. National Historic Landmarks are cultural properties designated by the Secretary of the Interior as being nationally significant. A National Historic Landmark, whether it is a building, site, district, structure, or object, must possess exceptional value or quality in illustrating or interpreting the heritage of the United States in matters of history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, or culture. National Historic Landmarks have a high level of integrity. A National Historic Landmark nomination will include a national context framing its place within the American story. National Historic Landmarks will be listed for a multitude of reasons, which could include an association with events and patterns of United States history, such as the Tuskegee Institute for African American Education, or Nicodemus, Kansas, a settlement that embodies the pioneering spirit of formerly enslaved individuals on the Great American Plains. A National Historic Landmark could be nominated for its connection with the lives of persons nationally significant in the history of the United States, such as the Mary Church Terrell House in Washington, D.C., or the Maggie Walker House in Richmond, Virginia. A National Historic Landmark could represent some great idea or ideal of the American people, such as the Capitol or Supreme Court and the values of democracy. It could be nominated for an architectural specimen, such as Unity Temple by Frank Lloyd Wright. Specific to this project, the work of Dr. McWhorter and Dr. Wiley built upon the original 1976 National Historic Landmark nomination by the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation using up-to-date documentation standards and criteria of the National Historic Landmarks Program. Notable revisions include correcting the period of significance to accurately reflect the date Woodson purchased the property, vast expansion of the narrative, inclusion of details associated with the National Park Service stewardship of the site, including the reconstruction of the property following the 2011 earthquake. Furthermore, in the update, the Woodson home is listed as significant under Criterion 2 for the properties associated with the lives of persons nationally significant in the United States history for its association with Carter G. Woodson. The property significance under Criterion 3, properties that represent a great idea or idea of the American people, has been further expanded in this updated nomination to illustrate how the home demonstrates and has come to symbolize America's faith and education as a central tool in combating racism and all forms of discrimination and in achieving true freedom and racial equality. The designation of his former residence recognizes Dr. Woodson's contribution to the American story as the father of African American history and to the discipline of the profession of public history. It is with great pride that I can say that on October 21st, 2021, the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Landmark Update was presented to the National Historic Landmark Committee with a resounding recommendation for signature. We hope to have a document signed in the upcoming year. I will now yield to Dr. Wiley to further describe this effort. Thank you.
Thank you virtually, Mr. Weldon. I will now introduce our final panelist. This is Dr. Amber N. Wiley. She's an assistant professor of art history at Rutgers University. Her research interests center on the social aspects of design and how it affects urban communities, architecture as a literal and figural structure of power. She focuses on the ways local and national bodies have made the claim for the dominating narrative and collective memory of cities, and examines how preservation and public history contribute to the creation and maintenance of the identity and sense of place of a city. Her publications cover African American cultural heritage, urbanism in New Orleans, school design, urban renewal, and preservation. She has served on the National Heritage Sites Research Committee of ASALH and on the National Historic Landmarks Committee of the National Park System Advisory Board, and on the boards of the Vernacular Architecture Forum, the Trobe chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians, and the Yale Black Alumni Association. Dr. Wiley.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen with you all. Good evening, or actually good afternoon. Maybe it feels like good evening. All right, and I'm gonna start my timer. Thanks so much for that great introduction, Ida. I'm happy here to be with you all, celebrating the life and legacy of Carter G. Woodson. I'll be talking about the process of updating the nomination form for the Woodson National Historic Site. As you all know, it is the former home, office, and workplace of scholar activist Carter G. Woodson, also known as the, quote, father of Black history. And as Mr. Weldon noted in his speech, certainly we're putting forward the argument too that he is the father of public history as we know it. So Woodson purchased the house in 1922 to serve as his residence and base for pursuing his lifelong commitment to the professionalization and promotion of Black history. He lived and worked there until his death in 1950. Through a partnership with the National Park Service, ASALH completed this nomination update, building on the work done in 1975 by the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation. And I'll talk a little bit more about them later. And I will also say that I completed this nomination in partnership with Dr. Maria McCurder and with the very valuable input of Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. So my primary experience with National Historic Landmarks and the National Historic Landmark Program stems from my time with the National Park System Advisory Board National Historic Landmarks Committee. It is a subcommittee of a committee, and here you see an image of myself and my colleagues at one of our meetings in the 2010s. The Landmarks Committee consists of 10 to 12 scholars and experts in history, archaeology, architectural history, preservation, and cultural resource management drawn from across the nation. The committee reviews National Historic Landmark nominations and National Historic Landmark nomination updates. You can update these forms for any National Historic Landmark, and that's what Maria and I were doing for the Woodson home. And the committee votes on whether to accept or reject or send the nominations back for revision. Upon voting for acceptance, the nomination moves toward the larger National Park System Advisory Board Committee, which then forwards those recommendations to the Park Service. So that is the kind of system through which National Historic Landmarks are nominated to the Park Service, and my previous experience before working with ASALH on this update. So goals of the National Historic Landmark update included architectural documentation reflecting major changes to the site, placing Woodson's significance within the national and local civil rights and Black freedom struggles, and exploring Woodson's renewed resonance and continued legacies in the 21st century. The background image here is a 1979 photograph taken by the Historic American Building Survey to document the condition of the site. And I'll talk a little bit more about that photograph in a minute. Here we go. So here is a side-by-side comparison of the two nomination documents. On the left, you have the 1975 document completed by the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation. On the right, a draft version of the document completed by Maria and myself in 2019. And if you look closely, you can see the difference in the length of these nominations. On the left, 10 pages, on the right, 74, which includes maps and photographic illustrations. To be clear, the previous nominations content and the extent of the research is typical for National Historic Landmarks at this time. So it's not that the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation did a lesser job of documenting the site. These were the standards in the 1960s and 1970s. And part of what we did was bring the nomination form up to the standards of the 2010s and also to 2021, because we were still working on it up until this past October. And we're actually doing revisions on the document right now in accordance with feedback that we got at the National Historic Landmark Committee meeting. So a little bit about the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation, who they were and what they were doing ahead of the 1976 bicentennial. The organization was founded by two brothers who were originally from Ohio, who made their way to DC, Robert DeForest and Vincent DeForest, because they wanted to address the Bicentennial Commission's lack of representation and engagement with Black Americans. Robert DeForest moved to Washington, DC in 1967 after serving in the Army. He then worked in public health in a variety of community organizations. Vincent DeForest, who is still with us happily, was also an Army veteran, as well as an architect who worked with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He participated in the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. So these two brothers, were quite active in civil rights in addition to what they would do in historic preservation. They co-founded the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation in 1970. And their mission was to increase participation of Black Americans in the bicentennial, to direct projects that highlighted Black history, but most importantly for them to, quote, be a vehicle for improving the lives of Black Americans. And so the image we see here is Robert DeForest announcing the establishment of the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation, also known as ABC, I'll be calling ABC, at the Frederick Douglass home in 1970, while it was undergoing rehabilitation by the National Park Service. And to his immediate left is his brother. So Vincent DeForest, in testifying in front of Congress in 1972, asked this rhetorical question: why should a couple of Black Americans who claim no lineage with first families in colonial America, who clearly are not showmen, and who have no money that allows them to pursue an interest in the bicentennial at their leisure and as a sideline, why should we have such a great concern for the bicentennial? Why should we be so presumptuous as to form a nonprofit corporation just to promote bicentennial ideas, projects, and programs? Well, perhaps it is because we have experienced the spirit of revolution in our own lives. We know that it is a continuing thing, and we believe much of the leadership for continuing the American Revolution in recent decades, and he's talking about the 60s, has come from Black Americans. What is this continuing revolution we seek to promote in America? We believe it is an ongoing process of decolonization. We believe it is a movement towards self-realization and self-government by people determined to be kept in subject status. The ABC's work was multifaceted, but the main arm of their initiative started in 1971 when they entered into a contract with the National Park Service to conduct a survey of historic sites for potential designation as National Historic Landmarks. At the time, the National Park Service had 1,200 NHLs, with only 3 directly and clearly celebrating Black individuals and their contribution to American history. And those are the homes of George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington, and Frederick Douglass. Additionally, there was no Black professional staff within the Historic Site Survey, the National Register of Historic Places, or the National Historic Landmark Program. The ABC contracted out work to researchers through ASALH, and who then surveyed and documented and developed data and nomination for sites across the country related to the national Black struggle. The organization was successful in nominating 65 National Historic Landmarks and districts to the Park Service by the end of their contract. This includes the homes of Harriet Tubman, Dr. Martin Luther King, Carter G. Woodson, obviously, neighborhoods and institutions as far-reaching as New Mexico, as far south as Georgia and South Carolina, up to the Midwest and Chicago, all across the country. So back to the nomination update and what our job was. So the National Historic Landmark Framework had changed significantly since the House's original nomination in 1975. And so our update provides a clear and thorough understanding of the Woodson's House significance and connection to Woodson and his accomplishments in scholarship in the advancement of African-American civil rights. So Woodson was active in civil rights and Black freedom struggles, both in DC, as we have seen today, and nationally. And he believed that education was central to combating racism and white supremacy and achieving true freedom. So we put it within these various frameworks that are now the different themes that the National Historic Landmark Program uses to talk about sites. And we expanded the criterion, so arguing that the Woodson home was eligible for nomination under its longtime association with Woodson himself as an individual. but also because it demonstrates and has come to symbolize Americans' faith in education as a central tool for combating racism and all forms of discrimination. And so these ideals are represented in Woodson's work through ASALH to promote educational pedagogy, as we've seen with Dr. Gibbons' presentation, and promoting information that debunked racist histories that underpinned Jim Crow oppression of Black people. And so in doing, Woodson laid the foundation for Black social consciousness that would grow during the modern civil rights era of the 50s and 60s. But as we also know, he did not live to see that blossoming. And so he tasked Blacks and other Americans with pushing the nation forward to realize its truest ideals of citizenship. And these are words from Dr. Higginbotham, who helped inform this particular portion of the nomination update. As historian John Hope Franklin noted in 1957, quote, Woodson's work was a valiant attempt to force America to keep faith with herself, to remind her that truth is more praiseworthy than power, and that justice and equality, along the state policy of this nation, should apply to all its citizens and even to the writing of history, end quote. So we talked about the period of significance within this nomination update. Initially, it said that it started in 1915 with the founding of the organization. But Woodson did not live in this house in 1915. And so we adjusted the period of significance to reflect the time in which Woodson actually lived and worked in the house. We documented we mapped the site in ways that previously had not been mapped, showing the home's location within the original 1791 L'Enfant plan for the nation's capital. We also talked about its inclusion within the locally designated and National Register listed Shaw Historic Districts, which you just heard about from Vaise, and the Mount Vernon West Historic District, so giving that context. We also documented the change of the neighborhood from the time in which Woodson occupied the home. So we have a map here from 1919, and the home indicated boundaries indicated in red, to present day condition of the neighborhood in Shaw and the changes that happened over that 100-year span. As indicated in this historic American building survey photograph, the Woodson home was in need of repair and maintenance as early as the 1970s. It is located within a neighborhood that sustained significant damage and disinvestment after the 1968 uprisings in Washington, D.C. That occurred after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in Memphis. And so while ASALH was able to finance stabilization of the building, major restorative work needed to be undertaken to guarantee its future. Between 2015 and 2017, the National Park Service completed an extensive restoration and rehabilitation of the house in response to damage from longtime damage, and also damage from the 2011 earthquake and a hurricane. And so the update fully addresses the physical characteristics of the building, identifies the current condition and the results of the restoration, and rehabilitation efforts. While some of the original materials of the house have been lost due to deterioration and damage caused by water, termites, and other factors, the rehabilitation meticulously restored much of the original building fabric. When materials were not salvageable, similar materials were used. In the instance where modern materials were needed, such as for structural stabilization, the materials are not visible. Following the recent restoration, which returned significant spaces and features to the period of Woodson's occupancy, the Carter G. Woodson home conveys a strong feeling and association with the time that the prominent scholar, historian, and activist lived and worked in the house. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing and beautiful. And when you go there, you're just excited. The work is astounding. The work that's been undertaken to preserve this building is really astounding. And so this update to the nomination provides a more expanded and detailed documentation of the site to allow for a fuller interpretation to the public of Woodson and his national significance. And as you all know, plans are underway to install exhibits and interpretive materials to create the Historic House Museum, which is indicated by the home in red here, as well as the interpretive center and office space in the off yellow buildings here to the right. And I'm about to close up. So I would argue, and as the morning panelists have made clear, and our afternoon panelists, that Woodson was not only the father of Black history, but the father of public history as we know it today. We just observed Latinx Heritage Month, Native American History Month. We also have Asian American Pacific Islander Month, Women's History Month, and so on. These are all based on the formula for dissemination of information to augment that taught in public schools, developed by ASALH under Woodson's leadership. Woodson understood the importance of historic sites for the promotion of Black history and pride. As he stated in the Journal of Negro History in 1937, quote, "Pilgrimages to monuments constituted another important feature of the Negro History Week celebration in 1937 because of a growing appreciation of the characters of history memorialized in the sacredness of the ground on which they labored for humanity. Places as the Frederick Douglass home, the scenes of the labors of Booker T. Washington, the birthplace of Paul Laurence Dunbar, the Sojourner Truth House, the Harriet Tubman Shrine, are monuments not the least imposing, but great because they are enshrined in the hearts of the descendants of those generations that those heroes served." I'd just like to thank you for the time and all of the people who assisted in the effort of updating this nomination, which will be available to the public once the revisions have been completed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wiley. And that is great. So what we're going to do is have our panelists come back and we'll have questions and answers. There was one question in the chat about the Presbyterian Church and its influence on freed people by Dolores Walters. And I just wanted to answer because the Presbyterians, like other Protestant groups, went south after the Civil War and opened schools for the quote freedmen. They became a very strong influence in the South, in particular South Carolina, and deeper South as well. So that was the answer to that particular question. I'll look for additional questions in the chat, but I think I'd like to ask a question to the panelists in terms of the idea of place and memory. And I think Amber or Dr. Wiley really helped us understand that. So this will be a question to all of the panelists in terms of how impactful, and if you look at the work of Mindy Fulop, Dr. Mindy Fulop, who's a psychologist, talking about root shock. And she compares how when plants are transpotted, when they're moved to another pot, the roots are shocked. And so therefore there becomes a situation which is trauma. So you look at African people who were transplanted forcibly from the continent of Africa to the Western Hemisphere, there was a level of root shock. And then the plantation to freedmen. So the idea of root shock. So the idea with looking at the need of the NACWC to crusade to save the Douglass home at the turn of the 20th century, and efforts by the ABC, and I'm happy you mentioned Mr. DeForest, because we all love Vince greatly and are very applaud him, as well as Eleanor Holmes Norton for their early efforts to do this and move that legislation, to kind of look at the physical space as part of this narrative. So can you kind of unpack for us, what does the physical space and the visiting of those physical spaces mean to one part of the psychology? And then that would be you and Vince Vaise. And then for Dr. Givens to look at the idea of the pedagogical instructions of this book on a lap. I'm really having an issue with the term fugitive, and I think it's somewhat limiting. And I would like to see if we could find some new language with which to discuss what that agency of Black academics were, especially those women, because those women were the front guard, the vanguard, were women educators. So once again, looking at the idea of place and impacting the physical history, and then pedagogically, what does that mean? So I'm gonna start with you, Dr. Wiley, then Mr. Vaise, and then to Dr. Givens in that order. Thank you.
Thank you. I was actually gonna give the floor to Mr. Vaise, but I'll go ahead and go if that's I'll go in your order, Dr. Jones. So on a personal level, I'll say that the physical means so much. I, grew up in Oklahoma City, but have family roots here in DC. My mom was a DC native, born and raised. And my grandfather migrated here from North Carolina, as many folks do. And he would tell me, they lived in Leroy Park, and he would tell me the history of the place. And this is in the 80s and the 90s. And he would say, oh, these great people lived here and all this history was here. And then we had the intelligentsia, and we had the activists, and we had the suffragists, and we had Howard Theater. And I would look around and I would be like, okay, Grandpa, because that's not what I saw. I mean, it required an extensive amount of imagination for me to see the history that he was telling me about, because if you know Leroy Park in the 80s and the 90s, U Street and Shaw, it was very much, still hurting from the 1968 uprising and a significant loss of tax base when people moved to the suburbs and disinvestment from the city. And the crack epidemic was high, gang violence was high. And so he's telling me these stories, but I don't see it. And it was really hard. There was a major disconnect in my head with the stories that he was telling me and what I saw on the street. And that's actually where my work started, quite frankly, with the stories my grandfather told me, because I was like, I need to see what he's talking about because I don't. So part of actually being able to see the history, the physical, and have the embodied experience of it is so powerful. And when the landscape is stripped of that, it's really hard for young people to see it in their mind's eye. And that's, I think, we're all in here, but it's certainly, it requires a great leap of imagination and faith if you don't have the physicality of the structures there to let you know that this existed in real life.
Thank you. You're on mute, Vince.
Just to add to what was said there very eloquently, again, going back to the work Dr. Woodson wrote on the importance of history, on inspiration and inspiring that next generation. And to give you an example with the Frederick Douglass House, when I came, there was an event we did every year called the Easter egg hunt. And I questioned, why do we do an Easter egg hunt? And some said Mr. Douglass did that, but we couldn't find any documents. And we really tried because we always like to be as accurate as possible. But when we got into the cultural history of the area, the Easter egg hunt came organically at the site in the 1950s and 60s at a time where, a lot of African Americans were not allowed to the White House's Easter egg hunt. And at also that same time, the Douglass home was being painted white because the Park Service hadn't done the paint analyses. And it wasn't even a National Park Service site at that early time yet. And it wasn't repainted. So in a way, the Douglass home stood as a big counterpoint to the White House there on Pennsylvania Avenue. And even to this day, it not only is inspirational, but when we do events at the Douglass home, people who've even been there many times, they just want to walk through it to get that feeling of it. Yeah, they can probably give a tour as good as any of the Rangers can, some of them, because they've been so much, but that it's a pilgrimage site. And I think when we look at these historic homes and these sites, they're more than just places where you get the quote unquote download on what the individual did. These are pilgrimage sites that are so important to that inspirational quality. For pedagogy, I'd just like to say that, and I'll use my father as an example. He's very much a kinetic learner. He was a machinist. So a lot of our visitors who come, not some of our visitors, and even a lot of our school kids, some like to read the books and get into the academia like us here, but there's another style of learning that people have, that people are like hands-on tactile learners. And for them, they need to go to these places. They're going to get more out of it because they're not, it would be harder for them to just read a book, a bio about Mr. Douglas or Dr. Woodson or Mrs. Bethune. But when they go to the site and they absorb it at the site and they hear the ranger speak or the volunteer speak or whatever, that really synapses and really gets it. And then for every visitor, I would say that relates it to their own experience. How many people on this Zoom, rhetorical question, will say like, oh yeah, I was there when I was 5 years old on a class, or my dad and mom took me there, or my uncle took me there, or when I was in the 6th grade, our class trip went there. You hear this over and over again, and it personalizes it to the person. And that's in a sense where those kinds of memories, those individual memories, are built at these places and handed down to the next generation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for, and learned so much from the co-panelists, and thank you for that question, Dr. Jones. I would say that, I agree with a lot of the work that folks have shared so far in terms of the kind of pedagogical resources that come with using physical spaces and material culture and things like that to help students understand not just the kind of stories, but also the kind of the material realities of things associated with the time that they're studying and the people that they're studying, but also to this question of, but I kind of want to I agree with that, but I wanted to kind of move to the other part of the question that you asked, particularly about, I guess, the language of fugitive pedagogy. And the reason that that's important is because, for me, one of the things that became really important was to try so much of the history about the kind of materiality of Black education prior to Brown v. Board. A lot of it has been to document the kind of the story of separate and unequal, right? There are these images of the lack of resources and the lack of material resources kind of afforded to Black folks in Black education. And one of the things that became important for me was to talk about, well, yeah, we can take that story of separate and unequal seriously, which is in many ways about the material history, but we also have to talk about how Black folks navigated these kind of constrained spaces and the kind of lack of material resources oftentimes, which is very much so central to the history of Black education and Black folks pursuing meaningful learning despite a lack of material resources, right? I think about the stories of, like, there's a formerly enslaved woman named Mandy Jones from Mississippi who talks about enslaved people going into literally into pits in the ground, literally under the earth to kind of have a school, right? And so that longer history of fugitive literacy among enslaved people, that kind of carries over to the ongoing politics of Black people navigating constrained spaces and lack of material resources, but still seeking out meaningful education despite that, right? And this language, this heritage of kind of fugitive pedagogy is actually a part of that story. And even, I was thinking about when Professor Wiley was naming those places that Woodson referred to, many of those places of pilgrimages, were of fugitive slaves, whether it be Sojourner Truth, whether it be Harriet Tubman, whether it be Frederick Douglass. And so for me, when I was kind of looking at the textbooks that Woodson, was writing about, or even the textbooks written by Black teachers before him, I started to see how the stories of these people, that many of them that were fugitive slaves, were functioned as these kind of folk heroes in the curricular imaginations of Black schools. So many Black schools named after Frederick Douglass, right? Carter G. Woodson himself went to the Frederick Douglass School in Huntington, West Virginia, named after Frederick Douglass, obviously this fugitive slave. But also fugitive slaves were very important for the very foundation of a Black educational tradition. The first kind of text by African Americans that really serve as the literary foundation for the Black intellectual tradition are narratives that are written by fugitive slaves, right? When we think about the slave narratives. And so that's kind of part of my thinking about why I found the language to be generative for thinking about this, especially, and also a lot of the language around fugitivity really comes from a lot of Black feminist scholars writing about Black women navigating constraint and kind of violence during the Jim Crow era and beyond, right? So I'm thinking about scholars like Tina Camp and Saidiya Hartman, who are actually writing about Black women navigating constrained spaces, and using that language to inform how I'm thinking about Black teachers, many of whom we know that the majority of Black teachers were African-American women, navigating these physical spaces that in many ways are stories of confinement at a particular level, but we also have to account for their agency in navigating that space. And so the language of kind of fugitivity that's kind of come from Black studies has been generative for me to think about that in relationship between the kind of material realities, but also the symbolic work that Black folks are doing as they're navigating these spaces.
Thank you for that response. And I'm happy to hear the term agency. I guess that's what my ear was kind of leaning towards, to see that there was agency in those gendered spaces. That was extremely revolutionary. There's one genealogical question from Mr. Prather, who's asking if Bob Woodson is a relative of Carter G. Woodson. I don't know which Bob he's referring to, but maybe a Washington resident. I don't know if you've come across it at all, Vince, if you know anything about genealogy for Woodson.
No, but I know our Woodson committee has been spending a great deal of time on that. So we'll take that in. If we could, we'll get his contact information and we'll look into that.
Thank you so much. There's a question for Dr. Gibbons saying, from Ronald Saunders, do you see any similarities in the epistemology as advocated by Dr. Woodson with reference to getting the teaching of Black history into the curriculum in the public domain with the epistemology advocated by Hannah Nicole Jones in the 1619 project?
I would say that the effort to create space in the context of schools for studying Black history and culture and kind of teaching against the grain in that way, I think anyone who's doing the work of Black studies or anything related with anti-racist teaching or the 1619 project has to understand that that space was really opened up and created by folks like Woodson, Mary McLeod Bethune, and the kind of, the African-American educators that created space for African-American history and culture to be recognized as a legitimate field of study, not only in the context of K through 12 schools, but also in universities. So anyone working in the current moment doing that work has to understand that, the work that we're doing is possible because of these folks that we've been talking about today. That's whether you were talking about the 1619 project or very many, a host of other projects that are also around today as well. So that's what I would say, not just about the 1619 project, but there's a lot of buzz around anti-racist teaching, and folks are talking about this as though it's a kind of a new phenomenon, right? And we know that it's not when we think about teachers like Tessie McGee, when we think about the teachers who sustained the association up and through its kind of, its foundational years, right? Those were folks who were doing this work before we had the language that we use to talk about it today.
And I have a follow-up question to that, but I'm going to go to the chat. Arnwin Smallwood asks, when sites have been erased from the landscape, such as the homes and neighborhoods of two of the A&T 4 from the Greensboro in a city like York, Pennsylvania, where all homes of leading Blacks from the Underground Railroad to the early 20th century, what should be done? So those physical structures that are no longer with us. Vince or Amber or Dr. Wiley?
I see we both unmuted. I'm gonna go let Vince start.
Yeah, can you repeat the question really quick? Because I want to make sure it's answered.
You're muted, Professor Jones.
Thought I had it down. My bad. Thank you so much. When sites have been erased from the landscape, such as the home neighborhoods of two of the A&T 4 from Greensboro, and in a city like York, Pennsylvania, where all homes of leading Blacks from the Underground Railroad, and they've taken the question offline. So I guess the question was, if sites no longer exist, how do you seek to commemorate those moments when they physically no longer exist in the narrative of public spaces?
Well, one way I've seen it done fairly effectively, and unfortunately, there's a great deal of places that have been since removed from the landscape. In addition to those, is a lot of historic markers. And even though people might say, "Oh, that's just a marker," you would be surprised. It acts as a very powerful trigger and a point where people can synapse on that. It's like, well, how many people have walked by and said, I wonder what that says. I wonder what that marker is about. And then they go over and then they read it and they're like, oh, I didn't know that happened here. And sometimes you see that in the form of very stately brass markers bolted to, walls of certain buildings. But you also see them in the more traditional historic marker as well. That I've seen them by the Maryland Historical Trust. If you drive around roads, you see them a lot. And then another one I would say, and the Park Service does this a lot in parks, but I've seen it in other places too, are those small little waysides. And a wayside is kind of like a little, it's not exactly like the same kind of thing as a historic marker, but it is an informational panel that is low to the ground, usually on a tilt, that has a photograph. And a lot of times then and now images are really powerful. So if it's a case like he said, where, say a whole grouping of homes are gone, if there's still a photograph of that could go on that marker juxtaposed to, say, the modern landscape. Because most of the time, things like roads, rivers, there are other key features that still may be there that could still provide a link so when people, oh, this used to be here, that link to the past.
Thank you so much. We're actually, I'll get you, Dr. Wiley, you can finish up. We're a little bit over time, but please go ahead.
Okay, well, I would just say that I haven't really seen anything that satisfies me in regards to vanished landscapes, right? And I appreciate markers, I do, because then you're like, oh, wow, this was here and now it's not. Why is that? But what we have seen, and this is something that ABC was trying to work against, is that, redlining, creating Black neighborhoods, then those same neighborhoods being targeted by urban renewal, highway construction, large-scale disinvestment. And in the case of someplace near my own hometown in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that people are just now discovering, race riots that destroyed a whole community. And part of what the issue is not just about historical remembering, but about reparations. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that, where there needs to be an acknowledgement of not only history loss, but capital loss, community loss. And so there hasn't yet been anything that I found to be satisfactory in terms of like the purposefully vanished landscape. People's homes are now parking lots, right? So there needs to be a more comprehensive approach to these kinds of sites, with acknowledgement that folks whose family members' homes have been destroyed or businesses have been destroyed still exist. And so that's part and parcel. That's a lot of what we're dealing with today in the preservation fields. But preservationists like to say that is not their, I won't say it's not their cup of tea. They'll just say that that's not part of what they do. That's actually not us. That's more along the planning, and the planners have to really consider, so it's still an issue, and it needs to be addressed in a more thorough and comprehensive manner.
Thank you also very much. And I think it's a very fitting conversation. That is a conclusion, but a commencement to really discuss this, even in terms of Black farm loss, over 16 million acres taken from Black farmers. So there's great levels of loss. Dr. Jarvis Givens, there's been lots of questions about your book in the chat. Please put your information in the chat, as well as Mr. Vaise. There's been questions about your PowerPoint as well, so we can know about how we're going to circulate that. I want to thank the panelists, Dr. Wiley, your work with Maria McWhorter on that application. I think we were astoundingly represented well when we heard the hearing of the National Historic Landmark Commission. So I'm going to turn it back over to Julie, and thank you all for attending. And once again, please consider joining our branches and partnering with the association as we go forward into 2022. Good afternoon and welcome back. We are going to start our closing session. The closing session is the Woodson Home and the Power of Place. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Pero Dagbovie. Pero G. Dagbovie is University Distinguished Professor in the Department of History and Associate Dean in the Graduate School at Michigan State University. He is the editor of the Journal of African American History, and he serves on the ASALH Carter G. Woodson Home Committee. And I will do a shameless plug for him. He's written a very readable text for the History Press, which is available at gift shops at the NPS sites as well as online. Dr. Dagbobi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones, for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm very grateful and delighted to be here this afternoon in celebration of the birthday of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history, who was born more than 140 years ago. I thank the Superintendent of National Capital Parks East, Tara Morrison, for the formal invitation to be here today. I thank everyone in the association for their support. I thank Dr. Evelyn Brooke Higginbotham, President of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I thank the Executive Director, Sylvia Cyrus, for her support over the years, as well as Barbara Dunn and Betty Gardner, who I've worked closely with on the Carter G. Woodson Home Committee. I thank Professor V.P. Franklin, past editor of the Journal of African American History, Vince Vaise, Robert Parker, and Joy Kennard for their support while working on the Carter G. Woodson Home in various ways. It's a great pleasure and honor once again to be here. I have been studying Carter G. Woodson's life and work for more than 20 years, and I always marvel at his achievements, his humility, his work ethic, and commitment to the African-American freedom struggle. He wrote back in the day, and I always use this quote in the 1930s, the following quote, "With the exception of $12 or $15 a week, which I spend on myself, and a smaller amount I give to a widowed sister, I turn back into the work all money which I can obtain. The only need I have for money is to relieve the stress of others," end quote. Woodson was a leader in the truest sense of the term, a servant leader, if you will. He literally gave his life to the cause of legitimizing and popularizing Black history. He called this struggle indeed a life and death struggle. That's how he viewed it. Charles Wesley remarked about Woodson, quote, "We do not have to ask for the fictionist, the poet, and the builders of dreams to create his greatness. Woodson has been a builder of his own monument," end quote. And our friend Dr. Woodson did not want this type of praise, at least not during his lifetime. I recall one instance where his quote unquote boys, who Professor Carr referred to earlier today, wanted to write a collective festschrift in his honor. And he said, "No, I'm not into that type of stuff. I haven't done enough for the cause yet. Spend your time on writing on others instead of me. I'm not doing this for my own self-aggrandizement. I'm doing it for Black people." There are many adjectives that pop into my mind, at least, when thinking about Dr. Woodson. In alphabetical order, for me, some of these include the following: Afrocentric, ambitious, cantankerous, collaborative, committed, driven, family-oriented, focused, frugal, generous, hardworking, humble, humorous. He had some jokes on him. Independent, outspoken, passionate, radical, respectable, serious, stubborn, and working class to the core. And I'm sure that those in the audience who know of Dr. Woodson in different ways could add different adjectives to this laundry list. Carter G. Woodson's accomplishments and his spirit are really embodied in the home, in the Carter G. Woodson home, national landmark, national historic site. As was mentioned earlier, he purchased this home in 1922 at 1538 9th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. for $8,000 cash. In 1976, the Woodson home was designated a National Historic Landmark. And on December 19, 2003, the National Park Service acquired the home in order to incorporate it as a National Historic Site. In February of 2006, the building was officially dedicated the Carter G. Woodson Home, NHS, the 389th unit of the National Park Service. From 1922 until his death in 1950, this historic space where Woodson lived on the 3rd floor served as the national headquarters for the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. It was the epicenter of operations for that early Black history movement. It was the space where people gathered It has a spiritual content very much to this day. Woodson is still in that home, if y'all know what I'm saying. The Woodson home, which will be open soon, will tell Woodson's life story, a truly extraordinary life story. According to the National Park Service, when we can finally roam into the halls of this home freely, when it's completely ready to go, it's gonna, quote, inspire and educate through education and the preservation of the home about this legacy of this preeminent historian and educator, Carter G. Woodson, end quote. And there's many people who've been involved in the tasks of contributing to the eventual opening of this home. The total setup and the floor plans and the exhibit narratives of the home make sense and they flow smoothly, as everyone will soon see. The key assets have been judiciously selected and include marvelous artifacts related to and or owned by Woodson, including the stool in that famous photograph that we saw from Ebony magazine, a pair of his shoes that walked the streets of DC, his Spingarn medal, and other items. The interpretive points of this design for this home are spot on, but we face a challenge in providing all the information about Woodson in this home because he did so much. It's impossible. His life was so encompassing and multifaceted. It's not possible to include everything. Yet I think the final product will represent his legacy and all of its complexity. As a historic space, this home will tell his life story without sugarcoating the era of Jim Crow segregation that molded him. It'll help us better understand the wide scope of his reach and influence. It will use Woodson and the Association for the Study of African-American Life and History as a window into the Black experience. It's going to serve as a porthole into the past that will help its visitors make virtual connections and vital connections between the past, present, and future. I'm really looking forward to this, enabling us to learn more about Woodson, his co-workers, and their monumental struggles that they devoted to this commitment towards Black history. They all had this notion, and Woodson talked about, of having a willingness to sacrifice for the collective good. We've heard a lot about Carter Woodson, so let me just do a little reflections on his life and work. And I know I'm going to reiterate what has been articulated by the excellent presentations this morning and afternoon. So please bear with me. And after all, it is Carter G. Woodson celebration for his birthday, so we have to give thanks and praises. So it can never be too much, because without his efforts, I don't think we would be here in the same way that we are today. Born in 1875, Woodson grew up in what he described as poverty on his father's farm and worked a range of manual labor jobs, including being a coal miner, as was mentioned. As a child, he had to work, so he couldn't go to school all the time and complete full school years. He once remarked that he grasped the fundamentals of reading and writing in his teens. And in 1920, he told Jesse Moreland, quote, "You should know enough about me to understand that I'm the most independently hungry man in the United States. I once drove a garbage wagon in my hometown, toiled for 6 years as a coal miner, often saw the day when my mother had her breakfast and did not know where she would find her dinner," end quote. During his lifetime, Woodson wore many hats, as we all know. He worked as a teacher, as Dr. Jarvis Givens has elaborated upon. He joined civil rights organizations. He worked under the direction of the U.S. War Department. He was an outspoken journalist who wrote countless newspaper columns, as Dr. Bernice Morris has outlined. He was a Black public intellectual long before the invention and conceptualization of this term. He traveled around the world. And of course, he laid the foundations for the scientific study and popularization of Black history, so it would not be a mystery. He mastered the art of balancing being a rigorous scholar and being a public history practitioner in the tradition of Howard University. In his late 30s, in 1912, as we know, he earned a PhD in history from Harvard, and he had to struggle to get that degree. They didn't want to pass him. They wanted to fail him on his comps. They wanted to make him do all sorts of silly revisions. They wanted to tell him that Black history didn't exist and that Black people did not have a civilization to take pride in. As we know, he became the second African-American to earn a PhD in history and the first and only one to earn a PhD in history with parents who were formerly enslaved. We know this, that he founded the Association for a Study of Negro Life and History 3 years after earning his PhD. We know that he founded the Journal of Negro History, now the Journal of African American History. We know that he founded Associated Publishers Incorporated in the early 1920s. We also know that he was very prolific. On top of all the other stuff he was doing and grinding out, he produced more than 20 books, including his famous 1922, The Negro in Our History. And of course, we can't forget The Miseducation of the Negro, which goes hand in hand with the theme of this year's celebration about thinking about what we can do with Woodson's legacy. His legacy is still here, obviously, on a daily basis. This book is still wide selling. That is The Miseducation of the Negro. He was the driving force behind what I'd like to call the early Black history movement, and he was a leading scholar activist during the era of Jim Crow segregation. He died suddenly in the home that we will all be able to visit. He died suddenly in the home, April 1950. His spirit is in that home, particularly when we conceptualize passing away in a home in many traditional West African cultures, the significance of that. As I've said, he was this institution builder who, and we can conceptualize this today, gave his life in ways to the cause that's hard to understand. He routinely worked 18 hours a day, gave his life to this cause. It's well known that he was this top-notch scholar because he laid these foundations for Black history, but we gotta highlight how he democratized Black history and popularized it. So let me end this by talking about a few ways that he did this, popularizing Black history. He acted as a personal resource and a repository for Black historical knowledge. He lectured throughout the nation. Just go read those newspapers from back in the day, especially the Black newspapers. They're littered with Woodson's name. He's always speaking in different places, the urban places, the rural districts. He did this for little fees sometimes too. He wasn't out to get paid. He was out to share the knowledge. He advertised the office home that we will visit as being this free clearinghouse for information on Black history. People would write to him all the time and he would send them back information and free literature about Black history. He would send them free kits and stuff so that they could study it and teach it and celebrate Negro History Week. In 1940, in the Negro History Bulletin, he said the following to people. He made the announcement, he said, quote, "Do not wait until the last moment to prepare for Negro History Week. Secure the necessary literature at once." And then he followed that by saying, just write me and I'll send you the stuff for free. He employed these field agents to sell books, to raise funds, to set up all these branches and clubs that still exist today. And he publicized Black history in other ways. Published easy to read scholarship for the children. Dr. Carr had mentioned that Carter G. Woodson loved the children. Indeed, he did. He loved the children. Many of his programs were geared at the Black youth. By 1941, The Negro in Our History had sold more than 40,000 copies. He created an extension division. You could take correspondence classes. It was an outreach type program in the truest sense. He opened the doors of the association, and that's important to today. Unlike many mainstream scholarly organizations, membership in the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History didn't have much to do and doesn't have much to do with one's educational status. The doors are open. Many can join. It's a welcoming environment. It's got this legacy going on. You go to the association meetings and it's a family reunion. That's why the COVID-19 pandemic is kind of messing us up a little bit because we don't get to congregate with all of those people who are committed to Black history around the world and around the nation who show up on an annual basis to our conferences. These conferences were amazing back in the day, and they still are today. Among the most active members, who, of course, as we know, have historically been Black women school teachers. The meetings during Woodson's times were always held in various Black community centers, churches, high schools, colleges, universities, and Black community networks. The first time, to my knowledge, that a meeting was held in kind of a mainstream space was at a major hotel in Detroit, and that took place in 1964. Now, the Negro History Bulletin, and I'm not going to go off on this too much because Dr. Whitehead gave an excellent, very detailed overview of the Negro History Bulletin. This paper was a popular magazine. Woodson had the Journal of Negro History, but said, I need to have something that, the youths can read, that the masses can read, that can be incorporated into schools. So he created the bulletin, and the bulletin was accessible. He published this, I think, at a loss. He wasn't banking and making money off of this. He sold it for a good price, cheap. He wanted school teachers to buy it. At the end of the year, you could get all the issues and bound it into a volume, and it could be used for school teachers, and kids would publish in there all the time under the children's page. The most important thing that Woodson did with popularizing Black history is Negro History Week, and we all know about that. It's why we have Black History Month today, or National African American History Month. It's because of Negro History Week. Woodson founded this in 1926, taking a cue from Omega Psi Phi fraternity in Nashville, Tennessee, I believe, when he visited them in the early 20s and saw that they were doing work like that. And he said, that's a good idea. Let me bust that out. And so he did it. Start out Negro History Week, right? His purpose was to integrate the study of Black history into elementary schools, to popularize Black history. He didn't want it to be Negro History Week. He wanted that stuff to be Negro History Year. He wanted to really have Black people's contributions incorporated into the national narrative. He wanted to expose young Black youth and the Black masses to their history so they could be inspired to achieve things in times of great duress and challenge. He wanted to expose white people to Black people's contributions, thinking that by doing so, they would treat Black people differently, perhaps. In the 1930s, Woodson said the following, quote, Negro History Week should be a demonstration of the past of the Negro and what is to be accomplished. A subject that receives attention 1 week out of 36 in school will not mean much to anybody, end quote. So when we think of the legacy, think about making this stuff year long. Just don't get out the dashiki and the kente cloth and the Black history stuff in February, of course. We rock that stuff year round, Woodson style. Woodson also founded that Associated Publishers Incorporated. And back in the day when he purchased the house, he put a big sign right up on that house saying Associated Publishers Incorporated. This was an awesome institution. It was one of the first few commercial Black publishing houses that Woodson hooked up, and he invested in it. This is what he said about Associated Publishers Incorporated, quote, we have no desire to make money. We seek to serve humanity, end quote. Now, we all got to get paid, but we know what the point was. He knew Black people didn't have a whole lot of money sometimes to buy books, and so he wants to make books accessible to people so they can learn their history. He was a community man. Let's not forget that about our friend, Dr. Woodson. He's a community man, gave to other people. He was generous, gave his life to the struggle, literally. Let people come to his house. Imagine that. You living in the national office of an organization you running. Stuff going on in the first floor, in the second floor. You're chilling and living in the third floor that's like kind of described as an attic, hearing all the ruckus all day and all that. The basement you can't even use because you're just storing books up in that mug and journals of Negro history. But he lived in his office. He lived in his house, and he let people come in all the time. There was always people up in there, listening to stories from him, meeting before conferences that were taking place in DC. He used it to store a whole bunch of books until he had to give some to, DC National Archives and the Library of Congress and donate others to other places. His house was like an archive. In fact, his house was a museum at times. His house was like a museum. I remember one time in the 20s, he opened up the house, to show to the community members because he had some African art from Benin, and he would allow folks to come in and check stuff out. So he knew that notion of what museum meant. And I'm not going to speak for him, but I think he'd be happy to see that the house is turning into kind of a museum. Because back in the day, he had a plan to actually build a separate freestanding museum. Didn't come to fruition, but he wanted to do that. So when we go into that house, we think of it as something special, We think of it as something special. as not just a place where somebody worked hard, but a space that brings people together to celebrate and learn more about Black history. I want to end with some recollections of Woodson. According to Mary Pearl Daughtry, who worked as a typist and secretary for Woodson during the 30s and 40s, Woodson wrote books in the house. You know, she recalled the following quote, and this is Mary Pearl Daughtry speaking, quote, "He would walk around his office," that is Woodson, "his eyes closed, his hands clasped behind his back, crisply dictating. Sometimes he would dictate whole chapters of one of his books without reference notes," end quote. She also added the following. This is Mary Pearl Daughtry again. "Dr. Woodson was a disciplinarian. You were at your desk, your coat off, ready to work at 9 a.m. sharp. His reputation for being strict was such that many graduates from Cortez Peters Business College in DC declined to work for him. But I was very well trained at the leading commercial school in Ohio, so I didn't bother. It didn't affect me. Besides, back in the 30s, you needed a damn job," end quote. And that's Mary Pearl Daughtry. He ran this house with authority, and he ran it with the notion that people were there to sacrifice for the cause. And that's how he treated people, is that he'd give you your props if you sacrificed like he did. And he had pretty high standard for that. What was the house like? I love this quote from L.D. Reddick. L.D. Reddick, 1953. L.D. Reddick said the following, quote, "I found myself at Woodson's home at 1538 9th Street Northwest. This was the headquarters for the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. The first floor was given over to the mail order work of the association. Woodson's office was on the second, third floor, and what an office. Books and magazines were piled everywhere, almost as bad as mine now these days. Papers and letters and gallery proofs covered the desk, but there seemed to be no actual disorder. The editor probably did more high-grade work at that desk than any editor I know. Woodson lived, that is, slept on the third floor of the small building," end quote. And that was L.D. Reddick. I got another nice recollection from, it is, W. Montague Cobb, a former student of Woodson and one of the 6 pallbearers at Woodson's funeral. He said the following, and this is Montague Cobb, quote, "The quarters of the association headquarters clearly showed the difference between form and substance. There was no money to spend on renovations, so none were made. No one would scoff at the unpainted front or bare wooden floors because the volumes and quality of work done in the house made any external trappings insignificant," end quote. And that was W. Montague Cobb reflecting on the home. And I think that when we go into the home, that they'll have some recordings of people's reminiscence of the home. Woodson took care of the home too. So when you go in there, know he took care of it. He didn't hire housekeepers to take care of the home. He did the work himself. And I remember that Lorenzo Johnston Green was amazed when he saw Woodson doing this work. Lorenzo Green said, quote, "Woodson was no snob. No work was too menial for him to perform," end quote. In the Journal of Negro History back in the early 90s, Willie Leanna Miles, who worked with Woodson from 43 to 50, recalled the home. And she had the following to say. She had an office near Woodson's office, and she said, quote, "Woodson seldom missed telling a visitor about the fact that he was once a coal miner and once earned a living as a garbage collector," end quote. That has to do with Woodson's humility. So I just want to close with a few comments, if I may. I could go on and on about Woodson, I'm sure, as everybody knows, but I think we've heard enough today. A former dean from Virginia Union called Woodson the high priest of Negro history in 1947. And I like that. And Woodson was a church-going man. Woodson did clearly have a sense of spirituality, belonging to several churches and organizations. And if we read the scripture, we will notice that Woodson was following much in the scripture, in the Bible. And if we read Proverbs, especially Proverbs pertaining to giving, like, for example, Proverbs 11:24, you will see that he believed that notion of, if it's within your power to give, give. He was the servant leader in the truest sense of the term. He was a leader in the sense that he had a vision. He had the ability to motivate people. He had the ability to mobilize people. He had the ability to inspire people. He had the ability to create a movement. And Woodson never asked anyone to do that which he would not do himself. And that was a high bar. And that's why he had low patience with people who weren't as committed as he was to the cause. You know, after he died in 1950, folks were scrambling. People were asked to take over, and they were like, nah, we can't do that. And I remember reading, I can't remember who said it, maybe Arnett Lindsay or somebody else, or maybe Rayford Logan. You know, when they was talking about who was going to take over after Woodson, they were like, it would take 4 or 5 people to take over and direct this in the way he did it. So what are we going to do? Well, we're doing what he wanted us to do because the association is still around today. And so when we start thinking about struggles that we face, just think of Woodson and do it in the spirit of Woodson. There are many quotes that I could end with from Dr. Woodson. I'm just going to end with one of my favorite Dr. Woodson quotes, and it comes from 1947. And it says follows, and this is Carter G. Woodson. I'll try not to imitate the voice. I've heard it sometimes, but I'll do the best that I can with my Woodson impression. This is Woodson, quote, "The servant of the people, unlike the leader, is not on a high horse elevated above the people and trying to carry them to some designated point to which he would like to go for his own advantage. The servant of the people is down among them, living as they live, doing what they do, and enjoying what they enjoy." End quote. And that's Dr. Woodson. Thank you very much for listening to me. I really, really appreciate it. I would much rather be in a local elementary school in Washington, D.C. doing this presentation, or even in the Woodson home. But we can't do that, and we're doing it over Zoom, despite the Zoom fatigue that we have. So once again, I appreciate everyone's attention virtually. Thank you very, very much. And thanks and praises to Carter G. Woodson.
Thank you, Dr. Dagbovie. That was a very fitting launch into 2022. We will now have remarks by Vaise, the Chief of Visitor Services for the National Capital Parks East. The stage is yours, Mr. Vaise.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Dagbovie, that was so inspirational. And I'm thinking 2023, you will have that chance to probably do that very talk in the Carter G. Woodson home, just as you articulated, and it would be a great honor to have you do so. I wanted to share a little bit of the actual preview of what this place will look like, the actual Woodson home when we go to when we reopen it very soon. So to follow up, we could not have done any of this without ASALH, without the guidance of Dr. Higginbotham, certainly the Woodson Committee, and really Dr. Dagbovie, what you wrote, Dr. Woodson in Washington, D.C., especially willing to serve, the historic resources study. I mean, those were the guiding documents that created what we're going to see in a moment. Dr. Jones, can you all see the cover slide here?
Yes, I can. I had to get myself off mute. Yes, I see your cover slide.
All right, cool. Thank you. Yeah, just want to make sure. So here's the preview of coming attractions, folks. So kind of the first reveal of what the permanent exhibits will look like. So as you look, you'll look here, you can see the Woodson home, 1538 in brick. However, as we all fully understand, the Woodson story is a great story to tell, a longer story to tell. So whereas he was able to manage ASALH and organize ASALH and the museum and everything from that one single row house, purely amazing. To tell that breadth of story, the 21st century, we needed more space. Plus, it was also decided to let the Woodson home be the Woodson home, to preserve as much of that historical integrity as possible. So therefore, the additional row houses, which were painted a different color to set them off from the actual Woodson home, were needed. You'll also see the entranceway. There'll be a very formal entranceway to provide that sense of welcoming, and as well as that sense of gravitas and stateliness. So if you look on Woodson's books, specifically the ones from the early years, the education of the Negro prior to 1861, history of the Negro Church, and many of those other early volumes that came out in the late 19-teens, 1920s, and into the 1930s, he purposely printed them on, the covers have that dark navy blue with good gold gilting, so that they conveyed a sense of the honor, the sense of the gravitas, that this isn't just some fly-by-night publication, that they had that stateliness with other, historical books of the time. And that Art Deco style that was starting to come into play in the 1930s. So playing off of that, the color tones of the entryway, you'll see CGW, Carter G. Woodson, the Art Deco, and again, that stateliness, very similar to those book spines. On the street, before you even go into the historic site, you're going to see these wayside markers. And again, the site will be open, but it won't be open 24 hours. So in the off hours, people will still be able to receive information, inspiration, and interpretation walking up and down the street there. And keep in mind, there's a lot of people, unlike us, who don't yet know about Carter G. Woodson, Dr. Woodson. So this is going to inspire them to want to go in and explore further. Again, going back to playing off of the books that were produced under the aegis of Associated Publishers and by Dr. Woodson. Again, you see the Negro History Bulletin, African Myths, the Journal of Negro History. What the design company, we used Howard and Revis. They're based out of Washington, D.C. They did exhibits for the National Civil Rights Museum as well as the National September 11 Memorial. So we a design company that really has done work on flagship historical sites, of which this one is one of them. The idea, the inspiration, the color palette, the fonts coming from the actual publications of ASALH itself. And I think that's really important, because just like Dr. Dagbovie said, Dr. Woodson is still present in the house, and everyone that was involved in this project fully embodied that. And we were able to imbue that upon the exhibit designers, and they were able to say, okay, let's gather from the printed materials here and use that as the source of inspiration for the color palette as well as the fonts. When one comes in, the idea of books, the books that influenced Dr. Woodson, the books that Woodson wrote that influenced others. So when you step in, you'll see you're literally surrounded by books. The spines will be some of the landmark titles that Dr. Woodson wrote, but you'll also have other publications that were done under the aegis of Associated Publishers as well. I would also like to say, if you look here, there'll be the tactile elements. We wanted every visitor to be able to effectively understand the story. So to that end, in the adjacent row homes, we're installing a large elevator so that folks who cannot walk will be able to access the second and third floors. We'll have a braille sheet, very much like this here, with tactile elements. So those who cannot see will be able to also understand the uses of the various rooms. So this is a state-of-the-art museum. And again, taking into consideration, ADA requirements. This is another side of the entranceway. Looking in here, you'll see, of course, Dr. Woodson, punctuated by not only the books, but also inspirational photographs that allude to elements that influenced Dr. Woodson and things that he wrote about, or that scholars under him wrote about. In this case, you'll see a photograph of African-American soldiers during the American Civil War, but also some of the great civilizations of Africa as well. New art, there's going to be a lot of new art, new commissioned art. And again, if you look, some of the new art here will take its inspiration from the woodcuts. And these woodcuts you see on the book plates in the original books published in the 1930s and 40s by ASALH, and common to that period. So again, new art. You'll also see, as we move our way through the exhibit, the different elements of Dr. Woodson's life. So we've talked a lot about today about his time as a coal miner. Though we don't have his actual mining outfit, but we are working to procure mining clothing from the era that will be showcased and put on display as well to show his origins. And then the chair, just like Dr. Dagbovy said, yes, it's going to be there. It's one of the key facets of the exhibit. And then some of the books that really were highlighted by Dr. Woodson, and you see that theme of books throughout the entire exhibit, like you see there, The Miseducation of the Negro. Not only is that like a large book spine that will enable visitors to focus on that and key on that, but you'll notice there's a little slit in there. People will be able to put their hand in there and pull it out, and then there'll be more explanatory text on a panel on other sides. So it's a way to make it more interactive, which is really great for school kids. You also see, again, the other side, we have the coal miner side, but then here you'll also see his a cap and gown from Harvard from the era when Woodson graduated. Shout out to Lopez Matthews for assisting us in picking out some of the other images that later were chosen to be used from the archives up there at Howard University. And pretty much everything that Dr. Dagbovy was saying, where Woodson would write, don't delay, contact me, we'll send your Negro History Week kits today. Well, those very flyers are going to be seen on the wall. This is the one I have to say that I just really love. The original sign of Associated Publishers that hung outside the Woodson home will be inside. It is being conserved as we speak. And then it will be a key feature of the exhibits inside. What I love so much even more is that this is being reproduced exactly, and it will then be put on the outside of the Woodson home, just as this original one was so many years ago. So when this is done, once again, people driving up and down 9th Street will see the proud sign, Associated Publishers Incorporated. Other touchstones to the past, they will see, like, again, coming back to that theme that Dr. Woodson is still in the house and present, is a book with his original signature in it. Again, people again have that very visceral connection to Dr. Woodson through exhibits like this. And then a lot of our other speakers today talked about the importance of the Shaw neighborhood, what it meant to be in a segregated neighborhood. And that came out very clearly in the planning for these exhibits. So you'll see here, there will be an audio visual display that will actually be, the film will actually be shown on these windows that will be closed, and then which will also act as, in a sense, movie screens. And you'll see the context in which the house existed within the broader framework of the Shaw neighborhood, photographs of the Shaw neighborhood during the 1920s, 30s, and 1940s as well. And then if you look to the right there, you'll see we got a number of Dr. Woodson suits, and they will be on display as well, again, so that you can actually see, well, how tall was Dr. Woodson? And that's the original suit, trying to have as much original material culture to provide those key touchstones to the past, to the visitor. Again, many visitors will read it, but a lot of visitors synapse on what they will see as well. And then images of the house itself. So again, on the right, you'll see a photograph of Negro History Week and the importance of that. We're really highlighting that importance of Negro History Week. Again, a lot of the lay public, even visitors that don't know about Dr. Woodson yet, do synapse on Black History Month. And so we thought it was very important to make that reveal that it began with Negro History Week, and how much of how important that really was. I mean, schools had competitions between each other, who could have the most elaborate Negro History Week demonstration. Covers of the Negro History Bulletin were often made into artwork and as decorative elements and interpretive elements for Negro History Week. So there's a whole story with that. On the left, the different uses of the actual Woodson home. That photograph is from 1963, and that's the Palmer Memorial Institute, students from that institute coming to the Woodson home. Going back to what we were talking about earlier as pilgrimage sites. And then again, using Dr. Dagbovie's research as a guiding light, when you really look at his work, it becomes very clear as to what the original home was intended to be. The first home, the first floor of the home was really the business element, where the secretary's desks were, where the packing and shipping room was, where the storage of the books, because in addition to everything else, the Woodson home was a warehouse. Certain rooms of it were for the bulletin and the journals. So you're gonna see all of that. The original scales that were actually used in the room will be there as well. And then moving upstairs, thanks to photographic evidence, we will be the Woodson Library, as well as Dr. Woodson's study, since we have a number of photographs of that, and certain elements like the step stool and the adding machine. Those two rooms will be furnished exactly as they were at the time Woodson was living there. I mean, very powerful then and now presentation. And then we also saw in an earlier presentation that short film of Dr. Woodson at his desk. Visitors will be able to see that in the room, literally being shown right behind the desk where he sat. And then the excruciating attention to detail. Just like Dr. Woodson did all the detail in the historical research, so too did we and ASALH in making this exhibit possible. So for example, if you look at that calendar, that's the West Virginia Paper and Pulp Company. We were able to get that exactly reproduced. And the way we found out about it was if you take that little video and blow it up like 1,000 times and really scrutinize it, you can find the date on that. So it's almost like forensics and getting down to that level of detail. But that was just crucial to keeping that story together. And again, upstairs, the third floor, where Dr. Woodson had his own quiet time, where he lived, and like Dr. Dagbovie said, where Dr. Woodson passed. I would also like to add, as much original fabric was saved, just like we alluded earlier, the original doors, including the original door knobs. In Dr. Dagbovie's book, it is described how the secretary went upstairs and tried a doorknob, and then they banged the door open and found out that Woodson had passed in the night. Well, that doorknob is still on that door. So again, powerful touchstones to the past. And then the modern exhibits are in the adjacent building, not actually in the Woodson home. Let the Woodson home be the Woodson home. But there is a modern story to tell, and there's modern linkages to tell. So here you see, how Woodson used history to empower. Also, it's a living exhibit. Every year, as we know, ASALH has a new theme. That new theme will be featured in this exhibit. So it's going to be changing as time goes on to reflect that. We also, history enlightens, and there'll be a whole section dedicated to ASALH, and you'll also see Omega Sci-Fi is prominently mentioned there as well. As we all know, Dr. Woodson was an Omega man. And then history preserves, the theme of historic preservation, the importance of preserving African-American heritage sites like the Douglas home, as you see here, but also how the Woodson home was painstakingly restored to save as much as could be saved. And then how history speaks to a new generation, and through different medium, not only through historical research, but also through popular culture, such as that CD, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. And then also there was at one point a brand of Nike shoes that referenced Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So through published materials, but also elements of pop culture as well. And then one of the overriding themes of the exhibit, of the whole the whole museum. Let truth destroy the dividing prejudices of nationality and teach universal love without distinction of race, merit, or rank. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, 1926. So as awesome as this looks in this little audio visual presentation here, in PowerPoint presentation, the real one will be absolutely epic. And put your calendars now. Again, don't wait, don't procrastinate, mark your calendars now for February 2023 for the grand opening.
Thank you so much, Vince. And I want to say on behalf of Dr. Betty J. Gardner and myself, Barbara Spencer Dunn, thank you to all of the presenters today. We cannot say enough about what you have done for us. What a legacy. And this will be on YouTube for perpetuity, ASALH YouTube channel. Wow, wow, wow. It was so amazing. And guess what, everyone? We have asked Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham to stay behind, and she didn't know why. But we are doing a special tribute at this time for Evelyn, our first president of ASALH, to serve 6 years, and she has done an exceptional job. I am Barbara Spencer Dunn, the Vice President for Membership for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. We are here to pay tribute to our tangible gift, Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. The visual that you're going to see, and I'm going to bring it up right now as I share my screen. Let's see if I can get permission to share my screen. And when I do, I'll pull it up. But the visual that you're going to see behind us, Evelyn, is going to be those who have shared the hallways with you at ASALH conventions. And I still don't have permission to share my screen yet. Okay, so we will move forward. It has been a joy, Evelyn, serving alongside you as Vice President. Our childhoods, me as a pastor's daughter and you as a granddaughter of a pastor, ironically, we ended our terms in the centennial year of Dr. Woodson's publication of the history of the Negro Church. That is ironic. And here is I can start this presentation now. If I can start it from the beginning. So the pictures behind that you will see a lot of people, thanks to Ruth Hodge, our life member, and Carl Dunn, all of these photos came from their collections. Pay close attention to some of the pictures. You're going to even see a picture of John Henry Clark and Leonard Jeffries. And Dr. Leonard Jeffries told me, Evelyn, that picture, they were having a conversation about starting the Association for the Study of Classical Civilizations. At these ASALH conferences, all kinds of conversations started, all kinds of organizations started. This organization is so powerful for us, and we heard about its legacy to us. So Evelyn, this year, we even got to fulfill visions with our partner, the National Park Service, such as the ASALH NPS Dunbar Kiamsha Peer-to-Peer Docent Project, and teacher training that expires, conducting 3 sessions at the Banneker Douglas Museum in Annapolis, the home of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, founded by a Woodson legacy, Dr. Benjamin Quarles. That training culminated with a field trip to the Douglas home and to our heirloom, the Carter G. Woodson home in Washington, D.C. Place-based training at its best, Evelyn. Your keynote honoring Dr. Woodson's birthday today made it clearer than ever to us. The Woodson home is our indescribable legacy, passed down as an heirloom. And you today have done it again, which you have done many, many times over the past 6 years as our national president. You have again provided words of wisdom, words of inspiration, words of challenge that will move all those who listened with intent to operate with their personal purpose in mind to help make this world a better place to live. Doing our part to continue the legacy passed to us as an heirloom. Today, all of ASALH will be represented by those who speak in tribute to you today, as we strive to continue to keep this legacy alive at the nuts and bolts level, just as your dad did upon Woodson's transition. You, Evelyn, like your dad, came to ASALH at a time when it needed reviving. Through your leadership, just as your dad, ASALH is viable and more visible than it has been for some time. We will pass the torch from generation to generation of the truth of our history through the arsenal of facts to be used as weapons to destroy the myths, lies, distortions that continue to seep through the fabric of this country. As God would have it, you were chosen to be in place as president of ASALH to sign the Master Cooperative Agreement that began in earnest ASALH's role to expand the stories of national park sites across the country. We pray those stories will give to others what Dr. Woodson gave to you, an introduction to your family members that you may have never known existed, or discovered new and more expansive stories, just as you did about your grandfather. Evelyn, you gave so much of yourself, and your shoes will be hard to fill. There are others that are going to speak. In fact, Sylvia Cybers was going to speak on behalf of the staff, but as you know, Evelyn, she is at our beloved Edgar Brooken's homegoing, standing in for you to read the proclamation. So Sylvia says, congratulations to you. And now we'll hear a tribute from our own superintendent, Tara Morrison.
And good afternoon, and I am thrilled to be able to participate in this tribute today. When I came into my position in December of 2016, one of the first things my predecessor shared was that I needed to establish a relationship with Dr. Higginbotham. I am so thankful for his advice and grateful for the relationship that I have with Dr. Higginbotham, which was critical to the progress made at the Carter G. Woodson Home National Historic Site over my past 5 years in the position. During Dr. Higginbotham's term as president, we have benefited from a stronger partnership with ASALH, both locally at the Carter G. Woodson Home National Historic Site and nationally across the National Park Service. When a new national park site, or in this case, a national historic site, is established, one of the important steps is the development of a long-range interpretive plan. The National Park Service partnered with ASALH in the development of the long-range interpretive plan, which would provide guidance to the National Park Service on programs, staffing, and other needs related to providing visitors with the interpretive and educational programs and materials at the site. During the planning process, Dr. Higginbotham and the ASALH Woodson Committee leadership expressed concern about the proposed thematic topics and the Park Service approach to planning. Dr. Higginbotham articulated these concerns with National Park Service leadership at the Washington level, which resulted in the National Park Service engaging more fully with the ASALH network of Woodson scholars. Through Dr. Higginbotham's efforts, the collaboration with the National Park Service improved, and the plan was developed within a year and paved the way for the development of the permanent exhibits that will be installed in February 2023. While performing the duties as president of a national organization, Dr. Higginbotham always made time to attend the numerous planning meetings and provide timely feedback on exhibit drafts, which were invaluable in keeping the project on track. Dr. Higginbotham provided organizational support to the Woodson Committee and personally engaged with the Parking Committee to craft the interpretive themes and topics for the permanent exhibits at the Carter G. Woodson Home National Historic Site. In addition to providing the insight, guidance, and methodology of a trained historian, Dr. Higginbotham has an institutional knowledge of ASALH that is unparalleled. We learned from her personal family history tied to ASALH and Dr. Woodson. She provided insights not only in historical detail, ensuring accuracy, but more importantly, in the overall tone of the exhibits. For example, Dr. Higginbotham's driving point was ASALH is Woodson and Woodson is ASALH. This provided a fundamental framework for the exhibit development. Earlier this year, we presented a regional volunteer group award to the Woodson Home Committee. Under Dr. Higginbotham's leadership, The committee, on behalf of ASALH, volunteered a significant number of hours contributing to the development of the exhibits and facilitated the donation to the National Park Service of over 140 original artifacts belonging to Dr. Woodson. Within ASALH, Dr. Higginbotham elevated awareness of the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Site by including me, the National Historic Site Superintendent, in the annual conference, both at the Woodson Luncheon and Business Meeting. Each opportunity introducing attendees to the mission of the National Park Service, the importance of preserving historic sites, and commitment to the ASALH National Park Service partnership. Dr. Higginbotham's leadership of ASALH facilitated greater cooperation between ASALH and the Park Service. Her efforts in bringing these organizations closer together extended the reach of the National Park Service, as ASALH promoted many of the programs and events that were done not only at the Carter G. Woodson Home National Historic Site, but also at the Frederick Douglass House and Mary McLeod Bethune Council House National Historic Sites. Perhaps most important, Dr. Higginbotham's legacy will be felt nationwide through the development of a national agreement between ASALH and NPS. This agreement leverages the scholarship of ASALH with potentially over 400 national park units throughout the National Park Service. For all of these reasons, we will recommend Dr. Higginbotham for the National Park Service Directors Partnership Award. Today, we present a certificate of appreciation from the National Park Service National Partnership Directorate and the Carter G. Woodson Home National Historic Site. The certificate reads, Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham for her contributions to the successful partnership with the National Park Service during her 6-year tenure as President of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, signed December 18, 2021. And this is co-signed by the Acting Assistant Director for Partnerships and Civic Engagement, Reggie Chappell, and Superintendent of the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Site. We look forward to our continued relationship with Dr. Higginbotham and building on the strong relationship with ASALH. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Who is Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, PhD, an African-American historian par excellence? ASALH is in her DNA, a dedicated supporter of ASALH branches, a mentor, and a friend.
Can you replace it? There are about 4 or 5 slides to that presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Who is Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, PhD, an African-American historian par excellence? ASALH is in her DNA, a dedicated supporter of ASALH branches, a mentor, and a friend. Dr. Higginbotham has been honored by our President, President Obama. She is dedicated to ASALH branches. There is a group picture from 2016. For the celebration in 2019, I did not envision having 2 dynamic speakers at the program. All the participants were just amazed how much knowledge these heroes imparted. On the top left is Dr. Ray Alexander Minter, the daughter of our founder. There's her parents on the bottom picture, Judge Raymond Pace Alexander and his wife Sadie Moselle Alexander, Esquire. Most of all, she's been a mentor and a counselor. There she is in the top picture with my late mother, sharing a laugh. The two women had a mutual respect for each other. The next day, we were at brunch with the pupil, me, who had no idea of Evelyn's quiet power and depth of knowledge, who generously gave kind counsel. There she is, instructing me on how to get the correct date. She pointed to the Tribune article. Regina, look at the date. It says November the 17th, 1927. And read the journal. And there it is, Dr. Woodson himself confirmed. On the June 30th, 1928, there is a branch in Philadelphia. Be well, get some rest. I love you and all the best in all your future endeavors. Thank you for your service, Dr. Higginbotham.
Thank you, Regina Vaughn, President of the Philadelphia Heritage Branch, first founded as the Philadelphia 1929, now that we know 1927 branch of ASALH. Thank you. And now we're going to be hearing our tech person is bringing up the next video, will be David N. Harris. We chose the oldest branch of ASALH and one of the newest branches of ASALH. They were founded in 2020, and we chose this branch because they are our first branch located in Huntington, West Virginia. Evelyn, I will say to you as well, as you were looking at those pictures in the background of the people that walked the halls of the ASALH conferences, it brought to mind Dr. John Henrik Clarke. It was a quote that Dr. Henrik Clarke said, they were so profound in finding out facts and truth. And when he was debating some of the scholars of the day, he said, when they asked him to debate him, he said, I only debate my equals, all others I teach. That's Dr. John Henrik Clarke, and I know you knew him well, Evelyn. And as soon as they pull up the next video, you will be hearing from our president of Huntington Tri-State Branch of ASALH in Huntington, West Virginia.
Good morning. My name is David Harris, and I'm proud to tell you that I am the president of the Huntington Tri-State Area ASALH branch. We here in Huntington are very proud of the fact that we're members of the organization, simply because Dr. Woodson left his footprint in Huntington, West Virginia. It's one of the places where he spent a significant amount of time during his stay here on this earth. He spent time in West Virginia, principally in Huntington, but also in the coal mines, where he taught people how to read and write. He spent time in Kentucky, where he did most of his formal education. He spent time in Virginia, of course, where he was born. He spent time in Washington, D.C., where he has his home that people visit today. And he also spent time in the Virgin Islands, among other places. However, we are proud of the fact that he spent time here because he was the principal of the high school here at Douglas High School when he did his stay here in Huntington. Evelyn, this is a tribute to you, and I'm proud to be doing this on behalf of the Huntington Tri-State Area group. I know that you are a person. My first impression, I'm sorry I didn't get to know you as well as I should have, but the time I spent with you, I created a first impression. And as they say, first impressions are lasting impressions. And as a result, my first impression is that you were very dedicated to the organization. And then my second impression, based on my talks with others, is that you were a godly woman. This in itself will take you very far in life. Continue to do what you're doing. We will miss you at ASALH. I wish you the best, and I'm proud to have this opportunity to be before you all to give this tribute to a very deserving person. I wish to say, continue what you're doing. Best wishes, and God bless you. Merry Christmas, everybody. Thank you.
For those of us who worked with Evelyn for a while, we know that she is squirming now, that she is wishing this would soon close out. She is so uncomfortable, but you have a few more minutes, Evelyn. Just wait, it will be over in a moment. Madam President, Evelyn, I honestly don't know how to verbalize, to express what your presidency of ASALH has meant to the branches and to me. You have been an amazing example of integrity, patience, scholarship, leadership. You have been an amazing example of what it means to just be plain old-fashioned polite. Because of your efforts, the association has reached heights and exceeded expectations, some that we never could have imagined. We are so grateful for your work. We are so grateful for your leadership. And best wishes, Madam President, and thank you for your extraordinary service. You've made us realize that we can be better than we even thought we could be. Dr. Evan Higginbotham, you have done an outstanding job. We are so very proud of you, and we just thank you for your leadership in such a time as this. We want you to get some rest and enjoy yourself. And a gift was sent to you, and I don't know where it is. It should be near you someplace. And so now you've been a gift to us. And now we have given something to you, just a small token to say thank you. Thank you for your outstanding, amazing, incredible leadership of integrity in such a magnificent time as this. Thank you, Evelyn. We love you. Open your gift and let us see what it is.
Well, before I open the gift, this came, Barbara told me not to open it, and I didn't, Barbara. I always, when people tell me, I hold a promise. I just want to say first though, this has been an amazing symposium. I'm just speechless about all the nice comments that all of you who made them about me. But I just want to say about this whole symposium, it was wonderful. Every single bit of it. I am so glad we had the intermission period where you could hear from Brother Marion of Omega Psi Phi, because he was fabulous. Bob Stanton, you are just so eloquent and so wonderful. And because of the initial problem, we didn't get a chance to hear you, but we did hear you in that intermission period. Pero, I can't, I put it in the chat. I was giving you a standing ovation. In fact, I think we should all just give him a standing ovation.
Yes.
Pero, you were just fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. And I mean, all of you were, Greg Carr, Kay, everybody. But Pero, you just took that thing out of the ballpark. So I just want to thank you, thank you, thank you. It has been truly my honor to be president of ASALH because it is a great organization. And I meant what I said when I said that we are all the heirs of Carter G. Woodson. We must carry out his legacy. And we have to do it now more than ever. You know, and I often get asked this question, as I'm sure many of you do. What are you thinking about with all this fuss about we can't teach history in the schools the way we used to teach it? We can't say things that make America look bad. And I always have to remind myself and to all of them, when Carter Woodson founded this organization, we didn't have anywhere the respect in history that we even have today. We weren't, I mean, either we were being taught that we had no history, or that we didn't have any worthy of respect, as my father would always say, or that we were awful actors in history. So Carter G. Woodson, that's the world he had to operate in. And so the world that Jarvis Givens talks about is a world where teachers had to teach the truth, even though it was outlawed in the schools. But we made opportunities through our churches. Many of our branches were born in churches, or they're still coming out or meeting in churches, or meeting in libraries. We had to tell the truth, because there was no, at that time, American Historical Association that was really putting out information about African Americans, the Organization of American Historians. These are all these professional organizations of teachers and academic folks in colleges and community colleges and university. None of those places, none of those organizations was telling our history, nor could we go to their conferences, because their conferences often were in hotels where none of us could even get into the hotel. So ASALH, we made a way out of no way. And we included everybody. We included everybody. We included every single race, ethnicity. Everybody was a part of ASALH. But we were a majority Black organization. And it was important for us to say we were proud of our heritage. And we didn't need anybody else to tell us that we had a right to demand every equality that anybody else in this nation has. And that's what our knowledge taught us. And that's what we're still fighting for. We're still absolutely fighting for. So I got this gift and I'm gonna open it. Okay, I'm taking the paper. So the first is a square.
Mm-hmm. and read what it says.
The square says, as an heirloom. Thank you so much. To EBH. And that's how I always sign my email messages to. And then today's date. And then the second thing is, oh my gosh. A gavel.
You have
Remind
gaveled
people that I
well.
was once the president. Well, with that, I should say, I love you. And the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.